Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth in a series of 6 installments on the psychology of chronic illness, making it normal. This is brought to you by the Bateman Horne Center in conjunction with myself, Timothy Wyman. I'm a licensed clinical social worker providing counseling services for Utah and Arizona residents through telecounseling. I'm also a member of the chronic illness community. I've formulated these presentations because I found through my own personal experience and as well as through meeting other people how there was such a gap between patients having providers and professionals communicate to them what is normal to go through. And so I wanted to create these as kind of that with the aim of kind of bridging that gap so that maybe you don't have to feel abnormal for too long or out of control with what you're going through. This is separated into 6 different, as previously alluded to, 6 different presentations. We covered the development and phases of chronic illness, anxiety, depression. Today we're going to cover identity, with future presentations covering relationships and religion, spirituality, and meaning making in the context of being chronically ill. We'd love for you to join us for each one if you find value in today's presentation. That being said, we'll dive right in, looking at identity and chronic illness. So I had this image, I just thought this image was perfect here for originally coping with chronic illness, as well as this quote in one qualitative study that I reviewed related to chronic illness. One of the participants said, open quote, "And your mind's going all the time, you're reflecting, how the hell did I come to be like this? Because it isn't me." So identity, the body is the foundation for all areas of our life. Work, play, love, sex and romance, our family duties. So if you're having a shutdown in your body or difficulty with your body, it's not, illogical that there's going to be a decline in issues related to these different domains of life. And we structure our sense of self around all these things and our roles. And if we can't live up to particular roles or how we think we should live up to them, it can really disturb our sense of self. I think, so in one qualitative, or in one study of studies, so meta-analysis, this was in 1998, researchers analyzed 292 qualitative studies of those with chronic physical illness. All these studies were published from 1980 to 1996. And from this study, researchers came up with what is called the shifting perspectives model of chronic illness. This model, open quote, depicts chronic illness as an ongoing, continually shifting process where people experience a complex dialect between the world and themselves. Patients bounce back from having the illness in the foreground, coping with the difference of the world around them, and seeking to access a sense of self and well-being in the foreground, where the self is the dictating focus and the source of identity rather than the disease. So this is an ongoing process throughout being chronically ill. How much does the disease define who you are and what you do, and how much do you or your inner self, the things that you find are your intrinsic values, your passions, etc. One person put it this way, having a chronic illness means more than learning to live with it. It means struggling to maintain control over the defining images of self and one's life. Similarly, one researcher found, he coined them symptoms related to chronic illness as biographical disruptions, meaning that you have your story of your life, and then all of a sudden your illness manifests or it exacerbates, and it puts you in a different trajectory than you had previously thought you were headed in or had wanted to go. Researchers have found that illness changes do not necessarily have to be wholly unexpected to be experienced as disruptive. So you could still know that it's coming, and it can still cause a lot of distress and difficulty in terms of re-accessing a solid, consistent, and stable sense of self. So there are 4 general terms that become important when talking about illness identity. I have these 4 terms here, and I'm going to introduce and define them for you. The first is engulfment. Now, engulfment is the degree to which chronic illness dominates a person's identity in daily life. Individuals completely define themselves in terms of their illness, which invades all domains of life at the expense of other self-assets. Secondly, we have rejection. Rejection is neglecting the illness and trying to avoid thinking and talking about it with others. Thirdly, we have acceptance, which is accepting as the illness as part of your identity without being overwhelmed. And fourth, we have enrichment. And enrichment is benefit finding or stress-related growth. As one author put it, quote, in contrast to the broader concept of benefit finding or post-traumatic growth, enrichment specifically refers to positive changes related to one's identity. Hence, it refers to the degree to which chronic illness enriches one's sense of self and enables one to grow as a person. So we're bouncing between these four things when we're dealing with identity related to chronic illness. These can be important in the context of like acceptance, for example. Research has indeed demonstrated that acceptance was related to less illness symptoms, whereas concepts related to engulfment were related to more symptoms. So not surprisingly, it's hard to know, the chicken before the egg kind of thing. Are people engulfed in their illness because of difficulty coping, which creates that engulfment, or are they engulfed in their illness because it's off the rails and it's just really disturbing life? I come to find that I really think that it's bidirectional, meaning that both are causing each other. Certainly if you have more symptoms and more disability and problems, you are going to be more engulfed. And at the same time, the way we respond to that exacerbation can even engulf us further or not. An interesting finding in the research too, related to this concept of acceptance, where hopefully we're working towards acceptance and enrichment, is that longer disease duration does not necessarily accompany more acceptance. So just because you may have had your disease for 10 years, it may not mean that you're more accepting. So we really have to put in the work to facilitate that acceptance and make it happen. Acceptance can be of primary importance because it is related to less depressive and anxiety symptoms, less illness symptoms, and pain, reinforcing the importance of integrating illness into our identity without making it our whole identity. So we're working towards that acceptance, that enrichment. You can find, perhaps if you're having a darker time, maybe you're slipping more into engulfment or more back into denial. We talked a little bit about some of this in our first presentation on development and phases of chronic illness. If you want to go back to that presentation, you can look at phase 1 and phase 2, the crisis and stabilization. Those can kind of be more about engulfment and rejection, and can be a part of the beginning of our process in dealing with illness. But again, as indicated by the research, not necessarily. Some of us can get stuck in those areas if we don't have the proper help and do the proper things to pull through them to the other side. So how do we, in the context of maintaining identity, in terms of solutions, to build a positive self-identity, we want to grieve what is lost to us. There couldn't be some things that might be lost to you forever. So accepting that and making peace with that and allowing yourself to have all the feelings and thoughts that come with that without it going into a place of complete darkness, that all is lost. Because so we want to make sure that we do that. Secondly, we want to actually, what can we reclaim in new ways? So if you loved, I don't know, if you were a dancer and you love dancing, maybe you can still go to dance concerts and find a way to validate that aspect of who you are. Maybe you can't go to all the ones you want to, but finding a way that you can, once quarterly or something along those lines. So we try to reclaim what we've lost in new ways. And then recognize as well, what have we been able to keep? What's been congruent and consistent throughout? I know for me, education is a big value for me, education and growth. And I can do that from my bed when I have really bad episodes. I can listen to podcasts or watch educational videos or things of that nature. So that's a new way, that's a way of reclamation and continuity as well. And then a fourth can be finding new ways, new hobbies, new passions, developing a new self that's important to you. And part of the chronic illness process is that your priorities and values might switch or might change and grow, and being open and accepting to that as just part of life. I think back to I can't remember who said it, but there was this quote that I knew of in which the person had said, the person who looks at their life the same way they do at 50 that they did when they were 30 years old has wasted 20 years of their life. So we should be seeing things in new ways. Our values and priorities should change with different life experiences, different stages of life. And if we can be open to that and see it as normal, and even if this last point, enrichment, is good, there could be good from this, that can be helpful for us, having an identity that continues. Similarly to this is Buddhist psychology. I talked about this in anxiety and depression. Buddhist psychology can be particularly helpful because there's a focus in Buddhist psychology in detaching from things, detaching from roles and particular identities, and seeing that your identity is actually just your timeless awareness. That at any given moment you can be aware of what's going on, and that's your continuity of being. It's a little deep, it's a little heady, but if you like that kind of thinking, it does show positive benefits for some of these issues that we continue to discuss related to coping with chronic illness. So next I want to talk about personality attributes and chronic illness. This slide and this topic could have fit easily in depression and anxiety, but I put it in identity because if I define what personality is from psychological terms, personality is persistent patterns in thinking and behaving and feeling that persist across different situations. So in kind of lay terms, when we talk about types of people, we're talking about personality. When you say something like she's this type of person or he's this type of person, we can find that there can be truth to that. Not always. Sometimes we overgeneralize how fixed people are, but there is some evidence that people can have what's called a personality, particular preferences, strengths, and vulnerabilities. And there is some research on that interaction in dealing with chronic illness and disease. And the first thing I want to talk about at this bullet point is the type A personality and hostility. So what is the type A? What's a type A person? If you're unfamiliar with this person is usually what's called highly neurotic. Now, neurotic in lay terms is used as a derogatory term, but it's actually a clinical scientific term in psychology. And basically, neuroticism is our sensitivity to experiencing emotions, and particularly negative feelings. Type A personalities, you can find words that can suggest a type A personality are like rigid, controlling, uptight, perfectionistic. Those are all kind of negative, but positive can be high achievers, reliable, organized. Those kind of descriptors can all be associated with a type A personality. Usually type A personalities are also highly conscientious, so they're really aware to the details, things of that nature. Now, it's shown that if you are a type A personality, or if you have a personality that's more prone to express hostility, maybe even as a way to cope with your type A neuroticism, the research is showing that you probably will have a harder time adjusting to chronic illness, and it can suggest that it might be helpful for you to get more support or help in that adjustment. Again, I want to make sure that we're working in a destigmatized, shame-free zone, that you're not bad for having that kind of a personality or tendency. Every kind of light casts the shadow, so to speak. So strengths and weaknesses come with all kinds of personalities, and different situation calls for different approaches and behaviors. But by definition, personality problems are when we're not adjusting our personality responses to a new situation. So if we're still responding to chronic illness with a type A kind of approach or hostility, that can cause problems for us. For example, in one study, type A behavior and hostility predicted heart disease onset and progression. So there really is an interaction between how we think and cope with things on our the physical manifestation of our disease and health problems. So if we also look at a second to type A personalities and hostility is there is some research on what's known as dispositional optimism. And we're all kind of have a tendency to fall on a scale of pessimistic to optimistic. And some of that appears to be kind of innate in terms of how quick you're able to, look for the best case scenario and believe it's going to happen. And the research shows that the more prone you are to have that dispositional opposition, the more prone you are to engage in what's called approach-oriented coping, which we discussed in the presentation on anxiety and depression. This is a style that is active and accepting of what's going on and takes proactive steps to deal with it. It also is predictive of what's called effective social support, and notice that it's an affective, meaning emotional. So people who have dispositional optimism tend to have more positive emotional support around them. Most people like to be around people who promote, joy and happiness and hope. So that shouldn't be too surprising. It also can be related to a reduction of disease-related threat appraisals. So that's kind of psychological parlance, but in lay terms, it means that these people typically don't see their disease as harmful, which can, again, quiet the nervous system and keep our disease symptoms at a lower rate. And then additionally, there is what's known as the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is one of the most robust findings in medicine, and currently, in random controlled clinical trials, often people have to show, or it's desirable that they show that their intervention goes above and beyond the placebo effect. Now, what the placebo effect is just our belief that something's going to work positively. And people just often need to believe that, and they can be given like a sugar pill and have improvements in what's in their health. So there really is something to thinking positively, believing that positive outcomes are possible and will happen. So that's a brief overview today of kind of personality and identity as it relates to disease. If you're interested in learning more and taking a deeper dive, here's a page of the references in which I drew some of this information from. We also invite you to join us for our last two presentations on the psychology of chronic illness, making it normal, and you can find those through the Bateman Horn website. We thank you for your time and attention during this presentation.